Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are all okay on this Wednesday morning. This is still week 4 of the spring semester. Before I begin to talk about today's topic, I want to cover two things that I promised you on Monday. First of all, I want to talk about the midterm task. I'll refer you to read again if you want in the on the syllabus details. What we will have to do in this task is to choose one topic from the topics that we talked about from week, pretty much going to be week 2 all the way through week 7. You can follow the syllabus to see what exactly I'm talking about in terms of the topics. You choose one topic, which is one of the theories, whether it is realism, neorealism, liberal theories that we talked about this week, additional theories we're going to talk about next week and the following week. Choose one of these topics and write a short writing assignment and prepare a short writing assignment based on this topic. What I'm expecting in this sense is to have about one page which um, describes the theory or the topic. What are the main arguments? What are the main assumptions of the theory? What are some of the main implications of the theory and how that explains the behavior when it comes to the international system, how that explains the actions that states are engaged in the international system based on the topic that you chose. That's going to be the first page or page and a half of this assignment. Then and I will show you that here, something that I've prepared in advance. I will send you later this week. You will have a list of podcast episodes of different podcasts that I've compiled for you. The different episodes are related to the different topics that we have. This is here, it is broken down by weeks. So material theory, so you have here different. What you need to do out of this list, which is not that long, but as you can see, I try to provide you with content for each one of the different topics that we're talking about. Choose one of those episodes, listen to it, of course. And in the second part of the assignment for the midterm, you will have to first describe what the discussion is about in this specific episode, and then how is this discussion related to the topic at hand, or how does it illustrate this topic. So if you decided to make your to talk about liberal theories versus material theories versus realism, so you can take this episode 12 of IS Off the Page podcast, which talks about the liberal and material aspects of US foreign policy. You write about a page and a half about those two theories, the main arguments of the theories, the main expectations, that the way that those theories explain the actions that states take in the international system. And then you go into the podcast episode itself, explain in very short about what the discussion in this episode is about, and then describe how are different examples discussed about in the episode, how are the authors that are discussing amongst themselves illustrate this idea for the topic that we have here, which is the liberal and material aspects of UN's foreign policy. So overall, it should be anywhere between 2 or 3 pages long, something like that. Do ask you to have a clear to state the references you're using if you're using specific papers that we've had for our different weeks. So tell me exactly which paper that you have used for that. Just when you write every writing assignment that you provide here, a normal reference list, and write it, of course, clearly. I will add the assignment on Canvas later this week, and the deadline is reminding you again, the deadline to submit that, you have it on your syllabus. The deadline to submit this assignment will be March 5th, which is a little less than a month from now. So you have enough time for that. You can start looking at the different topics that we have talked about until today and also for the following weeks, and think about what of those different episodes you want to listen to. Most of them are anywhere between 30 minutes to 45, 50 minutes, something like that. So it's not too long relatively. If you need help thinking about that, thinking about what you want to write about, you are more than welcome to come log into office hours and we can talk about that and think about what is the best, what is most interesting to you to do. Okay? So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about before we begin. The other thing, just a second. The other thing that I'm reminding you, yesterday I sent you, just one second. Here's our slide. Okay, so yesterday I sent you a link to the first survey task of this semester. The survey task, there was I provided with all the explanations in the email, in the announcement itself, and there are instructions once you click the link. All you have to do in this survey is answer a set of questions about different scenarios that you will read about. Should take you anywhere between 8 to 10 minutes tops. Just make sure that you answer and take it seriously and answer it, provide your opinion about those different issues. And the deadline to complete this task, reminding you again, is this Friday night. Okay, that's all the things that I wanted to talk about before we actually begin our discussion today. So what did we talk about on Monday? On Monday, I provided you with the introduction to the theory of liberalism. The focus of the theory is the idea of how states, what are the different incentives that states have to cooperate amongst themselves in the international system, rather than the focus on competition and conflict, which was primarily the discussion for realism and neorealism. I talked about one of the clear differences between liberalism and the theories we've talked about so far, which is the fact that the behavior, the actions that states are engaged in the international system are driven by what's called states' preferences, which are the different preferences of members of different groups in society. The elements that we talked about that are very important within this theory, norms, how important are norms in promoting cooperative behavior, not necessarily actions that are mandated by laws, but mostly like patterns of accepted behavior that everybody accepted that this is the behavior we should engage in, and those are norms. And then we talked about liberal regimes and how they affect or increase the likelihood of coordination between states, how that affects interactions between states and the international system. Then I talked a little bit about the theory of interdependence in the context of trade policy. How does the actions of one state affect the actions of another state, and how those serve as constraints? So the trade policies that I'm engaged in the international system are dependent upon the trade policies that a country like Canada engaged in. So we have to actually care and in a way coordinate amongst each other in order to generate more welfare for all of us. And again, overall, the bottom line of the argument here was the importance of state preferences and how they complement the realist views when we explain events that takes place in the international system. If you have any more questions about that, as always, you are more than welcome to email me or come talk to me during office hours. All right, so for the second half of discussion this week, we're going to rely on the discussion about liberalism, and that's provided us with a bridge into the nation-state level of analysis, reminding you way back in week 2 when I talked about the different levels of analysis, the nation-state was the second level of analysis when we are discussing events in the international system. And now we're going to shift and talk a lot more in detail about the role that domestic politics, that the nation-state plays in explaining the international events that take place in the international system, or explaining the IR overall. A little bit in terms of background, so scholars has recognized the need to account for whatever happened within states from a relatively very early. One of the early studies that introduced the research area of international relations, which took place way back in the 1930s. In those studies, the authors argued that international relations research is interested in describing, predicting, and controlling for the behavior of states in the international system, mostly focusing on actions on the violent type, so explaining military intervention, explaining hostilities, explaining war. But those same actors also said that when we explain those international type events, we cannot rely just on diplomatic events or military capabilities. Also, we have to account for circumstances which preceded those international types of events and took place within the states involved. So essentially what that means, we also have to account for what happens within states. The issue of domestic politics, the origins of this issue is the literature on what's called linkage politics from the 1960s, which focused on the relationship or the effects of different domestic factors and how that impacted behavior, especially conflict behavior, and the way that states engage in international conflict. In today's IR research, the lenses of domestic politics are central to many of the studies that are out there. A lot of those models that explain foreign policy choices will use what I already talked about it a little bit, and we'll talk about it more, but they use a game theoretic perspective, which means we look at the interactions between different actors and we identify their behavior, but we understand that this behavior is also related to domestic political concerns, which include both the policy preferences of members of the political system or the public in that case, but also different domestic institutional structures, such as the regime type. So the regime type of democracy has a different effect on the way that a democratic leader will behave in an international event compared to a regime of autocracy, just as an example. This literature and this research overall relies on one of the main changes or the main differences from the previous theories we talked about, is what's called relaxing the unitary actor assumption. We're no longer looking at the state as one entity. Many studies focus on political leaders rather than looking at the states in terms of their behavior. In that sense, the focus on domestic incentives highlight that there may be some institutional arrangements, so different structures of different countries that support the enacting different foreign policies, but the motivation for accepting those different foreign policies by those leaders is not necessarily in order to improve the welfare of the citizens. So the number one goal for political leaders is not necessarily to engage in a policy that will improve the welfare of the different members of public. It may be other motivations. One of the main motivations for leaders in that case, once we're starting to account for the domestic factors, is that leaders want to survive in their position. The president wants to stay the president. The members of Congress want to stay members of Congress. So political survival is a very important incentive for their behavior, and that has an effect on the actions that they're taking. One more reason to relax this unitary actor assumption is actually the way things are in reality. In the real world, there's very little consensus among elite decision makers on many different issues, even starting from just defining what is the national interest in a specific context. So if there's no consensus and no shared common opinion between elite decision makers on issues, we shouldn't be constrained by using this unitary actor assumption. Overall, the research on domestic politics views international relations not as high politics, which are separated from domestic politics, and instead it views self-interested leaders, so leaders that focus on their own political survival, and they're the ones who make the choices when it comes to foreign policy. And the different political institutions that those countries have systematically shape the choices and impact the events that takes place in the international environment. That's just overall background and understanding how exactly or why is domestic politics so important to understand those international events. All right, so I want to talk about the first paper that you had for today, which is the Putnam paper, and this is the two-level game, which provides us with a framework to understand global interactions, but by also accounting for domestic factors. So this is described by Putnam as what's called the two-level game. The idea behind that is, first of all, when you think about policymaking in the national level, domestic policymaking is affected by pressures from different domestic groups, which try to push for their own agenda, for their own interests as part of the policy. And the politicians, which have their own incentives to remain in power, try to create coalitions with those different groups in society in order to ensure that they will survive in power. At the same time, those leaders also engage in interactions in the system level, and states will try to promote their own policy, and the policy by those leaders will be focused on satisfying domestic pressures while also reducing any kind of adverse effects from foreign development or international development. So the idea is we're trying to promote different interests for different groups that are supporting us, both in a domestic sense as well as the international sense, and trying to minimize the extent of cost that they're paying. The leaders are going to be affected, or the decision makers, the political decision makers, will be affected by both of these levels. So both the demands in the domestic arena as well as the different demands in the international system will affect the way that the leaders behave. The problem in some cases is that a choice that might seem rational at one level of analysis may be counterproductive in another context. So, for example, a choice in the international system, a choice that's going to provide benefits at the international scale, for example, supporting free trade with minimum restrictions, may have negative domestic consequences. For example, if I'm supporting free trade in the international system, that may have domestic negative consequences for me because many of my supporters in the domestic area are actually favoring a protectionist type policies. So it might provide me benefits on one area, but might be costly on another one. So that makes, in a way, those policy choices, we can describe them, and that's something that Putnam mentions, is the idea of it's a double-edged sword. So I can get the benefits out of it, but at the same, I can also pay some cost about it. One way to think about those interactions between the domestic arena as well as the international system is to think about bargaining between two organizations. Both those organizations need to reach an agreement of some sort in their direct interactions, which is reflected in a way in countries' negotiated international system. But both of those organizations, if we stick with this example, are also subject to the constraint that any agreement that they can reach among themselves must be ratified internally. So any agreement that states are able to agree to has to be accepted or ratified by their domestic institutions or domestic constituency. And the most important aspect is that any agreement reached in level 1, which for us again is the international system, must be approved in level 2, the domestic system. And that creates constraints and certain incentives for the bargaining that takes place between those two organizations in the level 1 or the two states in the international system. Since there are expectations in both levels, both the domestic level and the international level have their own expectations, and those expectations drive the behavior or the actions of the negotiator or the actors in both levels, then that means that those two phases, this level 1 and this level 2, are never really independent. They're always related to one another. One of the important concepts that Putnam presents when he talks about negotiations in the international system and how that also affected by the domestic system is the concept of win sets. Win sets is, according to his definition, the list of all possible level 1 agreements that can be reached and are acceptable to level 2 members. So any potential agreement between two states in the international system that will be acceptable to members within those states. Two of the important aspects that he talks about within the context of these win sets is, first, larger win sets increase the likelihood of successful negotiation. So the more option you have to debate between two countries, the more likely it is that you'll be able to solve the interaction that you have with another country. He talks about the fact that the small win set is part of the explanation for the failed bargaining between the United Kingdom and Argentina early in the Falkland crisis. So when they started talking about and trying to resolve that crisis before it went into war, the fact that they faced small win set, there was a small number of alternatives for them to discuss the ways to resolve the crisis, small number of options that were accepted domestically in the UK or in Argentina, actually prevented them from resolving their differences, and eventually it also helped leading to the crisis and the war. The second point that Putnam makes is the relative size of the level 2 win set. So the size of the win set at the domestic level affects the distribution of joint gains in the international negotiations. And the more options are available in the international level, the more those negotiators can deal with their counterparts. So the more there's a possibility for actual negotiations with another country, and smaller win sets restrict the potential for solving those problems. So that's just overall. Now, there are three sets of factors, according to Putnam, that are crucial in the determination of those win sets. How do we get to those win sets? The first thing is the distribution of preferences and distribution of power within level 2. Reminding you again that level 2 is the domestic level. If the costs of a failure to reach an agreement are low, if there's low costs for that, then the win set is most likely will be small, because the alternative is just to remain in the status quo. So, for example, in the United States, the cost of failure to reach an agreement in the international system is relatively low because the country is relatively self-sufficient, and that makes it much harder to sell a negotiation. The United States can't stay within the status quo and not go back into the Paris Agreement, for example. And that means that the number of alternatives that American negotiators has, if there's any motivation to go back to those kinds of agreement, is relatively smaller, because the worst case is you stay in the status quo, you stay out of the agreement, the United States is self-sufficient, it can take care of itself. So this is one issue. Another point is the distribution of isolationists and internationalists is an important factor because it sets the power structure and the level of support for any kind of international bargaining. If there are more isolationists, that means that the win set is likely to be smaller because there's less motivation from different supporters of the government, whether it is the public or other members of the political system, that are willing to reach those kinds of international agreements, which in some cases, as I talked about on Monday when we talked about bargaining and international cooperation, requires some concessions. When the domestic preferences about the issue at stake, whatever issue that is, when there is diverse domestic views of the international agreement, then any type of agreement that the government will be able to reach will face criticism from both sides of the domestic debate. So some will argue that the agreement reached is too restrictive. Some will argue that it's too loose. As an example, the Versailles Treaty, which was a treaty reached after the end of World War I and debated different elements of how the defeated powers, mostly Germany, has to behave after the war, such as paying reparations and all those kinds of things. So the US public opinion on that treaty was on both sides of the aisle. On the one hand, some argued that it was too harsh on the defeated powers. Some argued it actually too lenient. So there was discussion on both cases, mostly because the domestic views of this specific agreement were very, very diverse. Another point to remember is that in reality, not all constituents or all members of society participate in the ratification process, and not all members of society actually are able to state their view on the international agreement. Therefore, those that see the issue at stake as most salient will exert the most pressure and have more effect on the range of options as possible. So that those that the issue at stake is more important to them will have the most effect on the number of options that are out there to actually solve that problem. Also, of course, when the multiple issues are at stake, the process becomes even more complex. And again, the group which will care the most about those issues will have the most effect on the potential options to address that issue, while also taking under consideration how that group accepts alternatives options to address the problem. So that's the first factor that Putnam talks about in terms of setting the size of the win set, the possible options to address those international bargaining situations, which essentially talk about different international types of events. The second factor that he mentions is the political institutions in level 2, so political institutions in the domestic level. The procedures for ratifying an agreement in a domestic level are crucial in defining the win set. The more complex and diverse the procedure, the win set will be smaller. As an example, in the United States case, the vast majority of international type agreement require Senate ratification, and that makes the win set for any type of American negotiators much smaller. Even when the ratification process is not official, it still might represent a problem because, for example, if the government is seeking large public consensus, then the win set will be smaller because there's a lot more people you have to satisfy. On the other hand, there are institutional elements that might enlarge the win set. For example, when there is strong coalition discipline, that's going to enlarge the win set. That means that when most members that are supposed to vote on those agreements, most of them are more likely to vote one way or the other. If most of them are likely to support the agreements that will be put before them, that means that there will be more options because, again, the possibilities to reach a solution are much more diverse here. Also, when central decision makers are autonomous from their level 2 constituents, So they will have more freedom and their win set will be larger. An example for that are central banks. If the decision makers that are not negotiating in the international level are representative central banks, they are not dependent on public support for their position. They are appointed by the government or by the parliament or the Congress in that sense. So there's a less effect of the pressure by public opposing to some kinds of agreement in that sense. So they will have more freedom in this option. Finally, the third factor is the strategies of the level one negotiator. So large win sets increase the odds of a deal, but at the same time, it also weakens this specific negotiator's position. If I'm negotiating with the country of Brazil, for that matter, and the negotiator from Brazil know that my win set, my number of options to resolve the problem are much bigger, I'm in a weaker position because it's harder for me to bargain in this case. I have a lot more options to think about. It's good on some level, but it also has a price. So what negotiators are favored the most is that their adversaries or their counterpart will have a larger win set that, and I will be aware of that, of course, and my win set will be relatively smaller. So I will have more bargaining power in that case. I'm sorry, a few more points about the whole two-level framework. Uncertainty is a very important aspect in this case. The level of uncertainty in the discussion is higher when negotiators have less information on the domestic situations of their counterpart. Again, if I'm from the United States and I'm negotiating with Brazil, and I have no idea what's going on domestically within the Brazilian political system, that puts me in a worse situation because it's harder for me to bargain in this case. And when we seek a solution that is intended to improve the outcome for both of us, then high level of uncertainty may lead to counterproductive outcomes, because we might reach a solution that will be good for me and possibly good for Brazil as well. But if the Brazilians are not likely to ratify that agreement, then the outcome is not going to be productive in this sense. A few more points is that the more diversity that exists in the domestic views of the issue, the harder it is to reach an agreement. I've mentioned that already. It's surprising when it's just diversity in sense of hawks versus doves, then it's actually slightly easier to reach a solution because it's just one or the other. But if you have more than just hawks and doves, you have 6 different possible opinions on that issue, it's much harder to reach a solution. One concept that Putnam also talks about is what's called the synergistic issue linkage, and that's when strategic moves at one level facilitate unexpected outcomes in another level. So reaching an agreement in the international level or reaching some kind of an agreement, and that has unexpected effects at the domestic level. That's something that might also happen. He talks about the paradox that some leaders face institutional conditions that make them much more powerful at home, but at the same time, it makes them very weaker when it comes to international bargaining. So, for example, leaders who are supported by many members of the society that are preferring protectionist type of trade policy, they may be very strong at home, but when they come to the negotiations table in the international level, they are in a disadvantage, because if they come with protectionist policies, it's very hard to reach settlement when it comes to trade policy. So this is one paradox that they're facing. And overall, the bottom line of this entire discussion is that a negotiator in the international level is most likely to emphasize his own or her own domestic audience before any kind of international audience. And that is the key driving force in their actions. And that's going to set a constraint on the types of outcomes we may face. And that's the idea behind this whole two-level game. The level of constraints that international actors are facing because of those domestic concerns. All right, so we began talking on Monday on the theory of liberalism, and which places substantial weight on internal domestic issues in shaping behavior, right? And I talked so far on the two-level game, which provides us with a theoretical framework to understand how exactly those two levels are interacting with one another. Now, what I want to talk about now is to shift from this theoretical framework discussion and talk about two-level games and how those two-level games are actually applied in reality. So what I'm going to talk about next are couple of more studies that we had for this week to read, and those studies highlight the effects of specific domestic factors and how they impact certain international events, mostly focusing on international conflicts. Here is just as an example for a two-level game in reality, some sort of reality. Okay. One central domestic factors that shapes international behavior is institutions. I've talked about that. For example, government composition and government structure. And let's see exactly what it means. I want to start first talking about the work by Professor Cook, which addressed the analysis of the expected duration of a conflict, which is the international system event, right? So how long does the conflict persist? And how long does the conflict persist is based, according to the arguments that we'll talk about now, on primarily domestic factors. So in this case, this is the composition of the government, right? So this is how the two-level game is applied in a research about real-life events, for that matter. For this study, the focus is democratic countries. And in order to integrate both levels of analysis, the domestic and the international, the main question we ask is, how does the government capacity to hold office, which means how does the government likelihood to stay in power, not to lose its political power, shape the duration of an existing conflict? How does the possibility that the government may collapse and not survive in power affect the international conflict that the government is also facing? The focus and one way to think about that is to talk about or to think about the composition of what's called coalition governments. The competition that exists between parties in these types of governments and how that affects international disputes. Now, thinking about this from that angle nicely illustrates the two-level aspects, because we're looking at how internal factors such as competition between political parties and the composition of coalition governments interact with external factors, which are the different effects that would take place in the international system and how they shape the outcome. The outcome for our discussion here again is how long will the conflict persist? So let's talk a little bit about what are coalition governments, because it's not something we have here in the US, and I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. Coalition governments are based on bargains between different political parties that reach an agreement to establish a government. Those parties, in many cases, represent different cleavages or groups in society, and the cooperation between those parties is not as strong as what's called a single party government. So in the United States, once the Democrats win the election, so the Democrats are the party that controls the government, and the cooperation is mostly with another branch of government. In this case, it's Congress, which is a little bit different. Then coalition governments are different parties which are coming together in order to form a government. Those parties are part of the parliament. And the example that you have, that's just the only picture I found that's going to illustrate that. That, for example, is the result of the elections in Iraq in 2014. So you have here different parties. For example, the party that's called State of Law, which was the party of the former prime minister, and it has 92 seats in the Iraqi parliament. But 92 seats is not the majority of seats. In order to get to the majority, you have to cooperate, bargain, and get in negotiations with other parties in order to have a majority. So he came along with those parties and other parties and represent a majority. Having a majority in the parliament allows you to form a government. I'll give you an example also from Israel. I don't have a picture for the Israeli example. Israeli parliament has 120 seats. So in order to form a government, the winner of the elections, the prime minister or any other representative who wins the elections, has to secure at least 61 members of the parliament to support him or her as prime minister. So for example, current prime minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a member of his party, which is called Likud. Let's say they have about 30 or 40 seats in the Israeli parliament. He still needs to secure, if he has 40 seats in the Israeli parliament, he still needs to get the support of at least 21 more members of the Israeli parliament. So those are different parties in this case, in order to form a government. If he has at least 61 supporters within the parliament from different parties, he can form a government and be the prime minister. What that means is that the stability of the government, of a coalition government, is not as clear, because any kind of disagreement between coalition members can lead some parties to decide that they will leave government, and therefore that's going to reduce its capacity to survive in office. Again, I'll give you an example to that. Let's say that the Israeli government has 61 members that support the government coming from 3 different parties. If one party from that coalition, let's say that this party has 5 members, disagrees with the existing policy that the government pursues, they will say, okay, we decide to leave the government, and now this existing government, which had 61 members, is now only 56 members big. So it doesn't have a majority in the parliament, and it may collapse. That's the idea behind it, and that's the idea behind the need of those different parties to reach an agreement among themselves, but that also creates less stability when it comes to coalition governments. Now, overall, the occurrence of an international conflict presents a context in which those risks may increase because the political costs of an international conflict are very, very high. Some members of the government may reject or push for more intervention, and those preferences can lead to government collapse. All right, but at the same time, even though I'm presenting here a picture which says that every time that I as a member of the government disagree with the prime minister, I can just leave the government and the government will collapse, it is not such an easy decision to leave government because it involves 2 types of costs. The first is what's called opportunity cost, and that is the decision by me. I decided to defect and leave the government. My decision to leave the government has a cost in terms of I'm no longer being able to conduct future policy. I'm not a member of the government anymore. An additional cost that is being paid is what's called transaction costs, which are the cost of replacing government. So if a government will collapse, now we have to do another elections and choose another government. There are costs for that, campaigning, the reputation that those that decided to leave the government will face. So those are additional costs that are being paid. Overall, the argument is that the higher those costs, whether they are opportunity, transactions, or both, it is less likely that a replacement will take place and the government will be more secure. If it's very costly to leave government, I will not leave the government, and the government will be more secure because of that. In order to link that dynamic in the international system, we're looking at the concept of critical events, which was one of the questions for your quiz for this week. Critical events are exogenous shocks that alter the bargaining space of parties in and out of government. These are meaningful events because they affect the ability of policymakers to achieve their goals. So examples include political scandals, wars, economic crises, and those kinds of big events affect public perception of the government, and therefore they pose a risk for its survival. And the question in this case, of course, is how? How is such a scenario, such as a war or economic crisis, will expedite the collapse of the government? Focusing on the conflict, a conflict allows external parties to question the incumbent capability to handle the crisis and potentially harm their political survival. So as I said, in the Israel example, there were 61 members of the government, right? But there's 51 more members in the Israeli parliament, which represent the opposition. They are outside of the government. Those outside members, those opposition members, can criticize the government for its incapability to address this international conflict. And that poses a risk for the government. This dynamic will escalate if there are members within the government itself, within the coalition, that are afraid of any kind of political electoral backlash, and therefore they will contemplate defection. Maybe members within the government will say, if we'll cooperate with some of those opposition parties and form a new government with them, maybe we'll be more stable. And that represents a risk for the existing government. That means that those actors are evaluating possible configuration of new coalitions that will allow them to remain in power despite facing this international conflict. In this case, the opportunity costs of staying in the coalition are much lower, and the probability of government collapse is higher. But overall, all those risks mean that governments will work very hard to prevent events such as international conflict from becoming critical. And for our discussion, what that means is that government will work very hard to make conflicts short, so they will not become big critical events, which might represent a risk for the political survival. Now, this kind of behavior by the government trying to shorten the conflict is highly dependent on the government composition. Overall, governments which appear weaker in areas of foreign policy will face greater risk of removal. and they're more likely to settle those disputes quickly. So if I'm a member of a government which is viewed as not as competent when it comes to foreign policy disputes, I'm facing more risk of collapse because of a foreign policy conflict, and therefore I have incentives to resolve those kinds of foreign policy conflicts faster. And in terms of the factors, the domestic factors that have an effect here, so partisanship is very, very important. Most research that exists today in political science suggests that left-wing governments are viewed as, of course, less hawkish, and therefore they're seen as less competent in dealing with issues which relate to national security and foreign policy compared to right-wing governments. That means that if I'm a member of a left-wing government, I'm facing greater risk of being criticized as incompetent and therefore maybe being removed when there is an international conflict taking place, right? Other relevant factor for this case is the structure. For example, if we have a coalition versus a non-coalition type government, so if there is a majority type government, which is similar to the government that there is in Britain, which includes, relatively similar to the United States, only two parties. So when one party is in control, then the risk of survival are much lower. And in order to account for that, we can think about the idea of the diversity of ideologies within the coalition. The diversity of ideology represents the potential for other governments to emerge, because if there's different opinions within my own coalition about the policy that I'm engaged in, and some of those opinions fits with people from outside the government, maybe those members in my own coalitions will prefer to form a government with people from outside the government, and my government will collapse. So those are some of the important elements that we have to think about here. Okay, so what is the author did? He used a little less than 600 military disputes in the second half of the 20th century, accounting for 20 democratic states globally. And the main factors that he tested were both domestic and international indicators. Thinking about the main factors from a domestic standpoint were the partisanship and the diversity of ideology. Because the analysis focuses on on the duration of the conflict. Okay, reminding you again, the main question that we're asking for this paper, for this study, is what is the duration of the conflict dependent upon those different factors. So because we are focusing on the duration as our dependent variable, the question is, when does the conflict end? We are, the author in this case, engaged in analysis that is called survival analysis, which is a class of models that account for how variations in different factors affect the probability that the event will fail. That's just from the terminology of the research itself. So what is the probability that those different factors that I've talked about here, the government structure, the partisanship, the ideology, will lead to an earlier conclusions of a conflict, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the results. So overall, what he finds is that left-wing governments tends to end disputes faster. So conflicts that are left-wing governments that face an international conflict are more likely to resolve those conflicts faster. So the duration of the conflict will be shorter. This is one finding that he has. Another finding is what you see here on your screen. This finding represents the relationship between the diversity within the coalition of the government and the duration of the conflict. So we have here on the y-axis the dispute in months. So this is the duration. And on the x-axis, we have here a measure for the level of diversity. Reminding you again, more diversity represents more opinion within the coalition, higher risk that some members of this coalition will defect and will form a government with members outside of the coalition, which essentially means that my government will collapse. What we see here is that at first we have high growing degrees of diversity, which leads to longer conflict. But once we reach some kind of apex here, around 10, 12 is the measure, the more diverse the coalition, the more members we have from different ideological perspectives within the coalition, the risk for the government collapse is higher, which means that the conflict that this government will be facing, they will try to make it as shorter as possible. The values here in terms of the duration of the conflict is much lower compared to the value here, right? So the more diverse the coalition structure, the more likely it is that governments will work much harder to make the conflict shorter. When he summarized this discussion, the author suggested that this result suggests that variations in government sensitivity to failure, right, combined with issues of international conflict, have an effect on the duration of the disputes. All right. So this is just one example to show how different domestic factors actually have an effect on the way that governments behave or the actions that government take in the international system. All right, a related domestic factor that I want to talk about here is public opinion, as well as the parliament's support for actions in the international system. When we think about a decision to enter into a conflict, so the previous study I've talked about ending a conflict. Now I want to talk about a decision in the international system, which is to enter into a conflict, to initiate military action for that matter. So domestic factors here have a very important effect. Two of the leading factors in this case, the first is public opinion. The other one is the ability of the government to maintain or get the support of the parliament, or in the American case, for example, having Congress support for the conflict. As an examples, historical examples, President Johnson, his decision to escalate the conflict in Vietnam in 1964 was only implemented after he already won the national elections in 1964. Similarly, the decision by former President George H.W. Bush to increase the amount of troops in Iraq, this decision was reached in October of 1990, but it was only implemented after the midterms, which took place in November of 1990. So that means that both the public opinion, which was reflected in those elections, as well as having the support of Congress, was important for both Johnson and Bush in their decisions to engage in different actions in the international system. One of them was escalating the conflict in Vietnam. The other one was sending more troops to the Middle East. Right? This is just an example. This discussion now focuses mostly on the work of Orsweld, which was the last paper that you had on the list for today. And the main argument that he offers is that leaders who are strong from a domestic standpoint, those who have domestic strength behind them, are more likely to use force. And this degree of strength from a domestic standpoint is also a function of the types of institutions that a country has, which depends on the type of democracy. And let's look at a couple of examples. So there's different types of democratic countries in that matter. We have presidential type, which is like we have here in the United States. There are coalition governments, and I already gave you the example of Israel, led by a prime minister. There are also types of governments which are what's called a mixed regime. In this case, type of a mix like France, which has both the president and the prime minister. Another type of coalition government is a majority type, which is what the United Kingdom has, which has just two parties in the coalition in their parliament. This is just different types of configurations. What you have here on the table, which is from the paper, is the different types of institutional configurations of democracies. And here we have the likelihood of the government initiating an armed conflict based on those domestic structures. So presidential and majority party regimes allow a lot more control for the leaders, because the president is not very much at risk of losing his position because of opposition by the other party. Therefore, those kinds of leaders are less sensitive to pressures by the system, and they're more secure and more likely to initiate threats and conflicts. So the American president in this case is a lot less constrained in initiating international conflict compared to the Israeli prime minister. And this is where coalition governments are a lot weaker, and the risk of collapse is much higher, not just when elections are closed. And that makes them less likely to engage in risky behavior in the international system. Now, so this is just different types of institutional structure. One more point that he raises here. So all regimes, whether it is presidential or coalition, are more at risk of collapse closer to elections. So the likelihood that those kinds of leaders will engage in international conflict is much lower. So whether it is the American president or the Israeli prime minister or the British prime minister or the Indian prime minister, all of them are a lot less likely to engage in those kinds of international actions, such as international conflict, closer to elections. Why? Mostly because they are concerned about members of their armies being casualties in combat, and that reflects poorly when elections are right around the corner. All right, so the author engages in those kinds of tests in order to see how is the effect of those domestic factors shape the decisions by political leaders whether to engage in international conflict. He compares the choice to use military force between the United States, the United Kingdom, and France in 2 cases. So engages in what's called a case study method from a methodological standpoint. Case study method is a comparison of historical cases focusing on the behavior of the relevant actions and focusing on the factors that are relevant for us. And I'll give you the specifics in a few minutes. What he does here, he compares 2 cases, the Suez crisis from 1956 and the Bosnia crisis in 1955. And the main benefits when it comes from the scientific standpoint of doing this research is that all 3 countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, all of them faced those 2 conflicts. All of them faced those 2 cases. All of them faced similar international conditions. So all of them were facing the same international conditions when it came to the Suez crisis and the Bosnia crisis. But the main variations was the institutional configuration of those countries. So the domestic institutions between the United States, the United Kingdom, and France were different. And this is the factor that we'll focus on trying to explain their choices, whether to use military force or not in those cases. Before I go into talking about those cases, and that's going to be the final part for today's discussion, I will stop for today's attendance word. Today's attendance word is the word Texas, such as the state of Texas. Attendance word for today, reminding you again, is Texas. All right, I will talk for a few more minutes today about one of the cases from this study, and that's the Suez crisis. If you want to know more about the Bosnia crisis, you are more than welcome to go back to the paper and read. So let's begin with a little bit of background on the Suez crisis first, on the Suez Canal overall. So just in terms of geographic location, this is Egypt, here is Israel, the Middle East. This is the Sinai Peninsula, which I talked a little bit about on Monday. And the small line that you see here, this is the Suez Canal. It was officially opened in 1869. It served as an important connection point from Europe over here to the Far East over here. It cuts the travel time from countries in Europe to the Far East substantially. It is 120 miles long, 800 feet wide, and 33 feet deep. Allows the transit of over 1 billion metric tons of products from any type. So both commercial products from different types, as well as in this case, as you can see here, is military hardware, an American aircraft carrier crossing the Suez Canal. So this is a very important point. It's viewed by some as a strategic choke point because it has a very important way to control maritime movement of products and military hardware around the world. So let's talk about the crisis itself. In the summer of 1956, July 1956, Egyptian President Nasser has decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, which means Egyptians have full control of the canal and they will decide who can go in and who cannot. The main incentive he had for this decision was the refusal by the United States and other Western countries to finance the Aswan High Dam project, which is an infrastructure project in Egypt at the time. This was just one reason for that. There was also growing concerns of overall Arab nationalism at the time and opposition to a lot of the actions that took place by Western nations in the area of the Middle East. So it was an overall rejections of Western policy in the area of the Middle East. And the decision by Nasser was to control and block the entrance to the canal to every country. The major countries that were affected by that, other than Israel, which I'm going to talk about in a second, were the major countries in the world that engage in those kind of international commerce, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany. Those countries protested the Egyptian actions right away. In August of 1956, the United States, Britain, and France convened a 22-nation conference in London to discuss the future of the canal. They offered several diplomatic solutions, which were all rejected by the Egyptian president. And the countries, ever since the summer, have been engaged in negotiations among themselves and amongst within the country, whether to take any kind of more extreme type of action, such as engaging in a military intervention in order to open the canal. In October of 1956, Israel has, in a way, solved that debate for everyone by entering militarily into the Sinai Peninsula, going all the way until the canal, and then taking control of the canal, and then handing over this control to the British and the French, which was a prearranged agreement between both sides. The United States did not send military forces, was not engaged militarily, but exerted a substantial amount of pressure on Israel to reach a ceasefire, which was reached in early November, and negotiations eventually led to Israel withdraw its military forces from the Canal area and the peninsula later in January of 1957. So this is a little bit of background on the crisis itself. There's a little bit more, I think, in the paper that you can read. Now I want to think about explaining why did the United States, France, and the United Kingdom behaved in different ways when it came to this crisis. So the first factor I want to talk about is the public opinion. So for the United States, early on, despite the fact that many of the American public view this area as important, only about 50% of some of the polls at that time supported a military intervention in order to resolve the crisis. In France, the public was very much opposing a military action, with about 20% support in September polls. But as time went by, going into October, late September and early October, the French public was less patient when it comes to this crisis and wanted to see some kind of resolution, mostly because they linked that to events that took place in Algeria at the time. By that time, France was already 2 years involved in a civil war that took place in Algeria since 1954. And in Britain, also, there was low support for military action, with less than 30% support by the British public to a military action. So overall, the public was against a military action, which was not taking place by either of those countries. But the more important factors we have to think about here are the different domestic institutions. So in the United States, 1956 was an election year, and November is general elections, in which President Eisenhower was facing a re-election campaign. He was unwilling to risk American casualties when he wasn't very confident that the mission will be successful. He was also hampered by a Democratic Congress, which was not likely to provide support for a military intervention in the international system that close to elections. So overall, that represented a constraint on American military intervention in this conflict. France, which is a coalition government, the prime minister at the time faced a very fragile coalition, which made the decision to engage in the military action very unlikely, such as Orwell talked about when I showed you the table early on. At the same time, he also faced public pressure as well as risk of defection from his own government, and all that made it very much harder for the French prime minister to delay the decision to take military action. But again, the decision at that time, early in the fall of 1956, was not to engage militarily. But again, the domestic factors here were very, very much important. For the British, the structure of the British government provides the prime minister with a lot more power in executing a decision to engage in the military conflict. Prime Minister Eden, which was the British prime minister at the time, at the same time faced a lot of internal pressure from within his own party that he has to do something and respond to the Egyptian aggression. So overall, we see here different types of domestic factors which had put a lot of pressure on those leaders in either France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, whether to engage in a military action in the international system or not. One of the important and the interesting distinctions between the French and the British at the time is that the British tended to delay the military actions mostly because they were concerned about international factors, and that was the pressure from the Americans, as well as some internal pressure by the parliament, but it was mostly pressure from the United States. The French, the decision to delay, were mostly concerned about the fact that the military action will fail, they will backfire, and that's going to be a risk for the government's survival. So both countries, both France and the United Kingdom, decided to delay the military action, but the factors that led them in this case were different. On one hand, it was mostly international for the British, it was mostly domestic for the French. That's another interesting distinction. Eventually, the one that solved this whole dilemma for everyone, again, as I said, was Israel, that Israel was the one who took the military action. At the same time, it still required both the French and the British to have partial intervention in this because they needed to resolve the crisis. But overall, this whole case represents how different domestic factors, in this case, mostly the institutional arrangements of those different countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, shaped their decision to engage in different or shape different motivations, whether to engage in a military action in the international system or not. All right, if you want to read more, so there's additional more paper if you're interested in that. reminding you once again about the midterm task. I'm going to open the task on Canvas later this week, and I'm going to also send you the list of episodes. If you have any question, email me. And one more thing, don't forget to complete the first survey task by Friday night. With that, I am finished for today, and I will see you this Friday for our face-to-face meeting, if you will decide to come. Bye, everyone.